Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium, and I'd like to welcome you to another webinar that we're doing. This one's going to be, I think, a lot of fun. I'm going to be joined as we start talking about the 7 deadly sins, and this particular one is the sin of not protecting corporate apps. So we're doing a series for chief security officers when it comes to mobile security. What are the 7 deadly sins that occur if you don't protect mobile, broadly defined? Today, we're going to be focusing on corporate apps provided by corporations, either for employees or for end consumers and customers. Standard perfunctory things. We will make slides available if people would like. We'll have an archived version of this up on the site within a day or so. If you have any questions for myself and my esteemed guest, who I'm going to introduce here in a quick second, please throw it into the Q&A section. Even if you have technical difficulties, please use the Q&A capability. The chat capability sometimes gets a bit wonky on us, so we try not to use it. So with that, we're going to dive in on the deadly sin of not protecting corporate apps, what can happen and what the ramifications can be, and also how can we defend ourselves. And we're going to be talking about some real-world case studies as well. I am joined by Rajiv Gupta. Rajiv is our SVP and General Manager of App Protection. So this is right down his sweet spot. So Rajiv, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
So we're gonna dive in here, and let's start off with the obvious, right? The obvious is, especially if you're on this particular webinar or listening to this webinar, you care about mobile apps, and as a result, of course, these things are critical now. What it used to be online apps, for instance, online banking is now mobile banking, and what's interesting is in this mobile world, for instance. Well over 50% of, right around 55% of all the online transactions now are done via mobile, but over 70% of the online fraud is from mobile apps and mobile browsers. So it's a huge part of our business, but it's also critical, whether it's for fraud or whatever the case may be. And as we get into it, of course, even though this might be an issue, let's say on a consumer device, which we're going to be spending most of our time focusing on, you're still going to bear the brunt of these damages. And I'm just going to fill this out real quick because we all know these things, right? And it's a bit of a BFO, a blinding flash of the obvious. But obviously, if things go wrong in your mobile app, people will hold you responsible for it. Even if potentially you're not responsible, they're still going to question your brand. There's still going to be theft that can occur directly. And then, of course, there could be financial loss, whether it's direct financial loss or compliance fines. And we'll talk about some examples on that. So clearly, these apps are very important to us, but they also bring risk if we don't focus appropriately. So that's what we're going to be talking about, is the 7 deadly sins of this, and specifically talking about corporate apps. So we like to spend a little bit of time looking at this and considering the fact that here's a very, very high level view of a mobile app ecosystem. And a lot of time has been spent on securing back office systems and APIs. A lot of time has been spent on using encryption and things across the internet, et cetera. A lot of time has been focused on securing your own app or trying to harden your own app. But there's still areas of exposure, potentially other apps and the device itself, the Wi-Fi networks people are connecting to. And that's going to be the real focus of today. So we just want to run through a couple examples of attacking devices and how that part, not the back office part or the encryption part, which would be a whole nother webinar, how these sorts of things can occur. And we're going to run through a couple of different examples for y'all. So the first thing is, and we talk an awful lot about this, and Rajiv, I would love your take on this. I'm not even so sure quite often that we can really give companies checks on the back office and the internet, and as we put on the app itself, sometimes people will do the app hardening, but they're still not really sure of what's in their app. And to date, the big issue has been the fact that there's nothing protecting the last mile. But, what are your thoughts, Rajiv, just from your experience on, I mean, do you believe the green checks are really green checks everywhere? What are your thoughts about exposures along this spectrum?
Yeah, that's interesting, JD. It's a traditional back office. There have been a lot of security products that help protect behind the DMZ, so to say. You're right, a denial of service and security at the firewall. But if you think about it, the mobile app, the online web app used to reside behind this DMZ. So, the corporates and enterprises, they're used to protecting that very well, and then only have the browser view your online app, right? But now that app has come out of the back end, and now it's sitting on your phone. So there's a lot of computation that's now happening outside of your DMZ and the firewall. So there's a lot of, you can think of it as a leakage of code functionality that has happened, and there is no security on that entire app stack when it's not in behind the firewall. So, think of it, the same exact code, same exact functionality that you were delivering on the browser, now you're delivering in the mobile app. But, that code that used to run behind the firewall is now running in front of the firewall on the mobile device. So,
yeah, that is a great point. And yeah, I hadn't even really thought about it until you said that, but that makes a ton of sense. And now all of a sudden, let's say you've got a really nice car, your app that you've got, and you have no idea what neighborhood you're putting it in. Because the only thing we know for sure is, you've asked any security person from the beginning of time, what is the single biggest risk in an enterprise? The answer has always been a carbon-based life form. It's always been human beings, right? And especially when you're dealing with people that aren't even in your company, you can't train them, potentially consumers who are the admins of these mobile devices. We've seen, and we're going to show you some data, they make some pretty bad decisions. And so your app is actually sitting in a really dangerous neighborhood. So a couple examples of this. And by the way, that there's multiple attacks that can occur against mobile devices. There's device attacks itself, which is elevating privileges and compromising. There's network attacks, like man-in-the-middle attacks, rogue access points, fake Wi-Fi networks, basically. And then there's actually malicious apps as well. What's not on here, but could also contribute to the problem, is mobile phishing. Now, ultimately, on consumer or on mobile devices, malicious apps, if they stay in their own little container, all they can really do is have fraud, click fraud, ad fraud, et cetera, within their own little bucket. In mobile, since all apps are in containers, they need to break out and elevate privileges, which is a device attack. If you have a mobile phishing attack where you open a mobile phishing thing on your email, and personal email, whatever the case may be, once that browser starts processing, it too can deliver an attack, which becomes a device compromise. So there's time-tested rules of security, one of which is persistence. And the bad guys are going to once they take over a device, they want to remain persistent as long as possible, and they want to be able to weaponize as long as possible. The only way to do that in a containerized world like mobile is to actually compromise the device, to elevate privileges, et cetera. So we have a couple examples of malicious apps that came in that actually compromised devices, which meant that your app sitting on that mobile device would be exposed. One of them is a company called Tesco Bank, and this happened a few years ago. And as you can see, it said weaknesses in the mobile apps left the door open for criminals to brute force, and they took £2.5 million. So there's been a lot of speculation about how this actually occurred. And this is the primary one that everybody's talked about, because clearly the bank didn't go out of their way discussing this. But we've got incredible mobile threat researchers here, and this is pretty much believed to be the way that it occurred. So let's say that there was a bank app on this. In this case, happens to be Tesco, and then you got the back end servers, as we were talking about. There was a malicious app that got on there that tricked users into giving an elevation of privilege. By doing so, it was able to hook the app itself and start injecting transfers. So this is one approach, and we're going to talk about another one here in a second called Bankbot. But this is just one example of the fact that, as you were just talking about, Rajiv, that what's happening on the device, which is now outside of the DMZ, is impacting the bank. And we mentioned a minute ago that it was about £2.5 million that was stolen. Well, they were actually fined, I think it's £19 million or £16 million, something like that. So it was a significantly greater amount of fines that came, even compared to the loss directly. So any thoughts on the Tesco example, or any perspective on it, Rajiv?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is a great example to show that sometimes the loss may be small, maybe a handful of users. We hear quite a few times that says, "Hey, I don't care if one person data or money get breached or compromised, right? It's not a wide spread attack." But if proven guilty, especially if you think about the compliance regulations like GDPR Article 32 clearly states that if it's proven that the enterprise has not done the due diligence in protecting their app correctly, even if the footprint of the attack is small, they're still liable and they still can be fined. So I think it's not about how much money is at risk. It's about compliance. It's about making sure you're doing the right things.
Right. I completely agree. Completely agree. So here's another example. Y'all may have heard about Bankbot, and we're going to talk about it. Bankbot is an Android piece of malware. We're going to go through exactly how it works. We're going to show you a video demo of how it works. But one thing that we do like to point out is our researchers. I mentioned the fact we've got the best mobile threat researchers on the planet. I can say that because I'm not one of them, although I'm a huge fan. One of the things these guys did is they actually got a version of Bankbot, one of the most recent versions, and broke it open. And we identified over 600 targeted institutions. And we've been starting to reach out to those institutions in a kind of responsible disclosure perspective to make sure that they know that they're in there. So if anybody that's on this call is interested in finding out whether their institution is on that list, please let us know, and we'll let you guys know whether or not you're on there. But here's how it works. What it basically does is the user will install a utility, and there's a lot of conversations about iOS and Android, and the fact that Apple does a great job of vetting apps and malicious apps. Google is actually doing a great job as well. The big issue with Android is third-party app stores are part of the ethos. It's part of the whole Android world. So most of these issues really come from third-party app stores, including Bankbot as a general rule. So the user will install some kind of a utility, it could be a level or whatever. They get tricked into accepting elevated privileges. We've seen this many, many times where users, I just got finished downloading this app. Of course I want this app, and I don't know why it's asking me for some of this stuff, but sure, I'll go ahead and do that. So now it's got elevated privileges. What it does is it monitors for targeted apps. I mentioned that 600 banks that are in there. And what it'll do is it'll keep an eye on that. And any of those 600 banks, if those apps are sitting on this device, it'll keep an eye on it. And as soon as somebody goes to click on that, they'll put a fake overlay screen on top of it, and the user just gives up their credentials. So this is again, another example of your app. Now, if your app happens to be one of the ones that it's targeting, you need to take one level of protection. But the fact that there are apps like this that are elevating privileges and able to look across and see other apps is a real issue. So in this particular case, we decided that a video would help. So we created a fake bank, and we're showing how this actually operates in this video. The left, of course, is the screen. The right, the phone. The right is an actual just straight up web page for the same fictitious bank. The lower part is the attacker's screen. So and we slowed it down here. You see just right there was a quick little thing where it popped up. We slowed it down enough for us to be able to see it in the demo, but the person is now typing directly into the overlay screen. And it's two-factor authentication. They get the code that's coming in, but you can see down here on the bottom that the code is also completely visible because the hacker is now monitoring everything that's going on there. So now what they can do is they can actually log in a just regular web browser. They can log in, and of course it's two-factor authentication on the phone, but since we're already monitoring that, we're able to pull that code directly off the phone without the user even knowing it and log in. So this is an example of Bankbot and variations of a theme that act that way. Any comments about Bankbot, Rajiv, or any thoughts on kind of what we just went through?
Yeah, I mean, so this is very interesting because if you remember that the research, the labs guys, when they came back with the list of 600 different enterprises that were part of this Bankbot, interestingly, 70% or so are actually the banks. There are 30% that are not even banks. They're just popular apps. So the Bankbot actually is not just banks, even though the name says so. But it does attack all different types of apps out there. They were definitely targeting more popular apps, but same exact technique is used actually in different ways. This is not new also. This is actually one of the very, very old techniques that is used again and again. It's, used to be called Matcher. There were other forms of malware that actually leverage exactly the same techniques. So, it's pretty interesting to. So of course the sophistication over the years have increased. This one is probably one of the most sophisticated one we have seen, but as I said, yeah, this is the technique is pretty common. We've seen quite a few times.
Right, exactly. And your point, by the way, about them just continuing to add to the list and not just banks, and that Bankbot's actually a bit of a misnomer, I think is spot on, right? So what do we do about this? Now that we have some idea of this, and this session was not intended to be a deep product pitch on Zimperium, but it is important to know that, if we're talking about this problem, we're talking about this last mile, there actually is a solution to this problem. So Zimperium, we have one core machine learning engine. I like to say sometimes that, BMW is not a car company, they're an engine company. They produce engines and they put their engines in a whole bunch of different things. We have one core engine that is zero-day detection of the attacks that we've been talking about across mobile devices on device. So we can detect both known and unknown attacks on device in real time, which is absolutely critical. Not having to go to the cloud, not having any delay associated with that. We train up in the lab, and then we put it down on the device, and we're able to respond to machine speed. Attacks are occurring at machine speed. You need to respond to machine speed, like what we were just talking about. Z9 can be rolled out in one of two ways. It can either be rolled out in a product we call ZIPS, for Z Intrusion Prevention System. That actually, if you're trying to protect a device 100% of the time, it's basically next generation endpoint protection for mobile. It runs 100% of the time, protects that device, protects the data. So if you're, for instance, using employees, that's what you would do. For this conversation, if you have a mobile app, we have an SDK, and this is the business unit that Rajiv is responsible for, where we can literally drop that SDK directly inside of any mobile app in a matter of minutes. And all of the detection capabilities of Z9 are at play for you. So you can respond and you can detect things in real time directly as a part of your app. And so as a result, we had on that last chart where we said, okay, we got danger on Wi-Fi. Well, we need to be able to detect whether or not there's a man-in-the-middle attack occurring when our session is going with our mobile app, right? What if the device has been compromised? What about other apps like, malicious apps like Bankbot, right? And then your app itself. So with ZIAP, by embedding this protection directly inside of your mobile app, we get to make sure that you have a visibility into how bad the neighborhood is that your app is on, and then you can decide what sort of actions you want to take. It could be something as simple as we're going to monitor and raise your fraud score, or you could take something a little bit more proactive. So to demonstrate this, we actually decided, we have put it in a new version of this fake bank that we were talking about. We actually, in this particular case, said we're going to we do the detection, but the app is the one that decides what action it's going to take, if any. In this case, we actually put in an action you could see whenever this, so we're back at Bankbot again. And this time though, this mobile app, the banking mobile app, has Z9 installed in ZIPS, or ZIAP, as we were talking about, and defends itself. And then the right side is the dashboard that comes with it, the management dashboard, and you'll see that the threat is identified, put up there in some forensics. So in this case, somebody goes and Bankbot tries to tries to come over here and tries to make the play, and there's an instant pop-up that says, you should really delete this. That just happens to be one of many actions, but the key was that it started by detecting that threat. And then the information on that threat comes directly into the console so that people can decide what sort of actions do you want to take. And oh, by the way, are you under attack? Are there certain things that you need to do from this standpoint? So Rajiv, with this example and talking again about embedding ZIAP directly inside of mobile apps, any thoughts, any color commentary?
Yeah. I mean, it may look like that, it's probably going to require a lot of work for this integration to happen. But funny enough, it actually takes less than 15 minutes from starting from registering an account, downloading the SDK, integrating it, and then protecting the app. It's pretty quick. And, the interesting thing is you get all this threat telemetry data. So if and ever your app or the device the user is using is ever get attacked, or there is a threat on the device, you would see all that threat telemetry data in the console. You can actually feed this data into your online fraud detection systems. If you want to raise, for example, a factor in the multi-factor authentication chain, you can do that. You can use the data for incident response. There's a lot of interesting workflows it enables, and it enriches the data that you're sitting on for you to make more informative decisions, right? In an event, there is a claim that comes in, you can actually take a look at it. It won't even just show you the latest, actual attack, but what led up to the attack, the entire cyber kill chain. You'll see multiple events tied together that ultimately led to the attack to happen. So very, very powerful in terms of visibility, in terms of protecting the actual app.
Right. No, I think you're spot on. That makes a ton of sense. And again, it's something a lot of people don't even know exists. That's probably one of our main challenges when we talk to people. They're like, "Oh, I'm glad that there's this capability. We didn't even know. We were just, literally just kind of saying, well, I guess we just have to, write off the fraud." And we're going to talk about an example here in a second. But there's one other thing that we want to talk about is, and Rajiv, I'd definitely like your take on this. We have another solution that sits behind Zips and ZIAP, and its capability that currently is called Z3A. And what it basically does is it will look at any app that we feed it, and it will give a highly detailed, sometimes 30-page analysis of the security and privacy risks inherent in the mobile apps. In the Zip side of things, a lot of times employees will use it to say, what are the apps, employers will use it to say, what are all the apps on our corporate devices that people are using to access our network? And are there any apps that have security or privacy risks inherent in them? But people that are developing their own mobile apps, and again, Rajiv's side of the business, this is highly, highly useful as well, because as we all know, developing mobile apps is usually a bunch of Legos. There's a bunch of libraries, a bunch of SDKs. Very few mobile apps are made from scratch internally. What happens is the developers are responsible for a certain thing, like let's say accessing contacts or accessing a camera or whatever. They'll go out on the internet, they'll find a library and SDK and throw it into the app without realizing that it might be doing something like unencrypting data or sending traffic to a foreign country or instantly putting it into an ad network, something that is potentially increasing the risk, the privacy and security risks. And so a lot of our folks that are doing mobile app development and securing mobile apps with ZIAP also complement it with capability like Z3A to say, we want to know before we roll an app out whether it's got any of these issues. So Rajiv, you want to talk any more about this, or any other thoughts about the importance of it?
Yeah, I mean, as part of the software development lifecycle, early visibility into what kind of a privacy security risk my app poses out there, I think it's invaluable, right? Means I know a lot of companies, they do static code analysis, they do dynamic analysis, even employ third-party pen testing towards later stage in the app development lifecycle. This really nicely complements that entire approach where you get full visibility into every build of every version of your app. And we are actually working towards releasing a flavor of this particular capability that will allow you to do comparison between your builds and see where the spike happened, what happened on the yesterday night build that caused my risk to spike up, for example, or for that matter, how my app or the components of my app or the pieces of my app compare to millions of apps out there. You do not want any part of your app to start resembling with some malicious apps out there. Maybe there's a fake app out there. We will be able to actually provide you all that visibility and insights, not just looking deep into your own app, but then comparing your app with the different versions of your own app and all the other versions of all the other apps that are in the public app stores out there, to give you, very, very invaluable insights. Right. So I think this is going to be a great offering, but more importantly, huge value as part of the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, that the enterprises can have.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's been amazing how many folks are like, yes, we definitely need this, because we don't really know at the finite level what sort of risks we might be having, and we'd rather find out ourselves than find out when somebody else discloses that and people go nuts. So, real quick, an example, the ZIAP example, we mentioned it earlier. We have various different customers. One of our customers is a major bank. And they agreed to let us provide some information back on what we discovered in the first 30 days of deploying ZIAP inside of their mobile banking app. And what happened was we detected 26,000 devices that were actively being attacked. This is not just at risk. They were actively had been attacked or were under attack at that point in time. By the bank's own estimation, it gave them visibility to prevent potentially $1 billion worth of fraud, because these were devices that were compromised, devices that were attacked, devices that that clearly everything in their bank account was now suspect and potentially could be lost, along the lines of what we were showing in the Bankbot demo. What's interesting is the composition of that. I mentioned the fact that the ultimate goal from a persistence standpoint of a hacker, and the only way that they can actually survive and weaponize outside of an app container, is to actually compromise the device. And what we discovered, of that 26,000, 80% of them were compromised devices. Now, I think it's interesting that when you go down to the 6% that were malicious apps, chances are those malicious apps were the delivery mechanism for some portion of those device compromises, but then so were the network attacks. What I think is really interesting about the network attack data is the average banking session is about 7 minutes long, which means those 3,000, that 12% of the compromised and at-risk devices we were looking at, the users were actually sitting on an active man-in-the-middle attack or active rogue access point, fake Wi-Fi, during the banking session. So it was pretty fascinating for us across the board. So, with that, Rajiv, can you, with the ZIAP in particular, these are some of the questions that everybody always asks, and you started hitting on one a few minutes ago. Can you kind of run through, the minimal risk and friction component of ZIAP? Because obviously it doesn't matter how good the value is if you're blowing up my app or if you're slowing down performance or anything like that. So can you comment on these?
Yeah, absolutely. Means it's the platform. First of all, it scales to unlimited horizontal scale. Means we have really huge volumes of devices on the platform. It works flawlessly. The ease of implementation I highlighted. It takes hardly 15 minutes to integrate the SDK into your own app. Now, of course, once you have the visibility into the threat and the risk on the device, what you do with that inside the app is going to be up to your product manager to decide and define. You can do pretty complicated workflows, or you can just simply report it up as part of the fraud API. So it's all, a lot of different ways to remediate. But a simple integration is definitely, pretty quick. And the best part is, the entire detection is non-invasive, right? It happens in the background, no visibility to the user. It means the user doesn't even know that there is actually a threat detection component running in the background. Absolutely no impact on UX at all. The footprint is pretty minimal. Means there's no bloat to your application in size, or there's no impact on the CPU or the memory utilization. Even the battery footprint means you'll have to work really hard to even see a blip in the battery utilization if you're actually going to try to find that how much of the battery drain it adds to your app. It's almost minimal to zero. So there's basically no degradation in performance. So there's no reason for somebody to say, hey, I don't know if I should be adding it. It's really fast and easy. And as I mentioned, the telemetry data that you get, the threat events, is amazing amount of visibility. Today, you're millions of users out there, and you have absolutely zero visibility on what kind of a risk you're sitting on. And this gives you amazing amount of visibility into the kind of risk you're sitting on, and you can take appropriate actions based on all the threat telemetry data that you get back. All right. And as I mentioned, custom remediations, you can, a lot of the times, the apps have interesting things. We know that caching is an integral component of most of the mobile apps, because the consumers are not always on the very high network or bandwidth. So, to accommodate for bad networks out there, we always use a lot of caching on device. We always have, even if you're using white box crypto or any sort of an encryption to encrypt the data on device, the decryption key is not far out. It's right there somewhere lurking in the memory, on disk or somewhere, and not very hard. If the device is compromised, it's not really hard for the bad guy to find that decryption key. And if not, means the data when displayed back to the user is always decrypted, so that we can show it on the UI. The bad guy can always scrape it from the memory and whatnot. So as part of the remediations, some of the recommendations that we provide out there is of course, delete the cache, burn the keys, delete the IDs, invalidate the session, log the user out, truncate the transactions. There's a lot of different ways to handle it. And if nothing else, just make sure that you report that potential fraud to the backend, so your fraud teams can actually have a better visibility into the threat telemetry and whatnot, right? So a lot of interesting ways to leverage the data.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. That is perfect. With that, folks, quick summary. Obviously, we know the damage can be significant. They can occur across the entire chain. We've been really focused on the fact that the user devices are vulnerable to attack, that the users are the admins. Those are the ones you're putting your things on. And so even if you've done a great job on all the rest of it, whether it's through hooking an app and injecting transactions, whether it's from putting up fake apps, that of course, never even reach your back end until they log in legitimately, like we did with Bankbot. These are the things that we have to be concerned about. And then we've got ways that we can help you. ZIAP from the embedded SDK standpoint, and Z3A from a software development lifecycle improvement standpoint. That's kind of DevSecOps, building it into the process. So with that, we thank you all, and we're going to see if there are questions. So feel free to put the question directly into the Q&A section, and we will start to run back through it. Okay, perfect. We did get one question about whether or not an institution or institutions were in Bankbot, and so we will get back to you for that. And then let's see, it said, can you explain how you integrate protection with Bank app? Is it only for mobile? Yes, we are iOS and Android today in terms of what it is we're doing. And then, like I said, we'll make sure we get back to you with some of the bank targets that you were asking about. So thank you for that question. See if we have any other questions coming in. It appears not. Well, thank you all very much. And Rajiv, thank you. It's always a blast, and I learned something literally every single time you and I do these together. Your commentary about the fact that traditional web apps, everything was behind the DMZ versus the mobile apps where it's truly out on the device was a great point. I really appreciate that. So thank you again for your time, Rajiv.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a great day. Appreciate it.